Should we start this thing? Yeah? Okay. So, welcome back the small number of people who have made it this far to believe. I don't think we have enough people for 5 breakout rooms unless each breakout room has 2 people in it. So, I think what I'm going to do is we'll probably just do a group discussion with all of us. I think that's probably going to be the most productive way to sort of go forward with this. So what I'm going to ask folks to do is just like move towards the front, please. For the folks who are online, there is a Zoom link that Mariah is setting up and has posted. Yeah. So Mariah's going to run an online discussion while those of us here locally have more of a local sort of discussion. There's 3 people online. Okay. Yeah, we could just like tear this space apart and move and just like point all these chairs at each other. Oh, put them on the screen. Yeah. Do you want to just put your laptop here? Or actually, if you send me the Zoom link, I'll just. Huh. Oh, there's. I can plug in. Oh, that was the wrong button. Just ad hoc this. Theoretically. I think it'll be okay. Can someone online say something? Sorry to complicate your lives, tech folks. Yes. Is there one of these that I should choose? I hear a noise. It's coming through that. So I suspect that's probably not it.
Well, we could also have a discussion where the online people can hear us if we use links. We just pass a link, and then they can contribute via the chat.
Okay. Oh, I think maybe this gentleman will help me. We should still do that anyway.
Let's see. Oh, you're plugged in already.
Yeah, I'm plugged in.
Okay.
I'll turn it up on the other end. Is there? So right now, if I
I'll
hit.
just have to turn the volume up over here. Should get it.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, apologies for the technical figuring out of things. We want to make sure that folks in everywhere can participate remotely and locally. Could someone say something online? So
So,
that's so weird. It's only coming here?
yeah.
That's so bizarre. I mean, that's clearly the right output. Like, I can't change anything after the audio goes out of this cable, so. So the Zoom's going through that audio, and
Decimator. Okay, so we don't want that one.
oh, you don't?
No, let's go back. Okay, so the output should be speakers. Or not speakers, I'm sorry.
This one here,
Decimator.
or this one here?
It
'Cause-
should be your headphone jack output.
Yeah. So if I hit this,
Mhm.
the audio's coming out of that.
That's correct. Yeah, it's going to it.
Yeah, we could try that.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you do that on Discord? Thanks.
Mind if I check it?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Decimator speakers. Actually, I think it's like an output. I don't think it's that one. Pretty sure it's. Yeah, usually it says headphone jack or
So
headphone. It should be your headphone output.
that should be one of those two. But when I put it on that one and I hit the this down here, which is what my system is doing the output to, right? If I hit that
Yeah.
and then I
okay, go
hit the
back.
volume,
Can you go
the
back?
sound
into
comes
that?
out down there.
Yeah. All right. So go back into that the previous page you have.
Yep.
And you need to hit this one.
This
right
one.
here. Let's try that now.
But now, oh, there we go. Okay, cool. So then if I switch this, I think we actually have it solved. We can stay in this Zoom room.
Hooray!
Yeah, we can hear you. Yay!
Yay! Now you have to listen to my voice. I'm sorry. I have the same authority as Matt.
All right. Wonderful. So what I'm going to do is switch back over to this really quickly. Yeah, I'll just share this really quick. Make it so that we can see everything. Don't actually need this. And people. All right. Thank you all for your patience. I think we kind of came to the conclusion that we don't quite have enough people to do a bunch of breakouts, so maybe it'll be a bit more fun and interactive for all of us to just have a little discussion here. So Mariah has a microphone that we can use, and we can. So we had a bunch of different topics we were going to maybe talk about. We've got ethics, sort of based on Casey's talk at the beginning, like what would ethics be as a component of rigor and validity. We've got working with diverse populations and settings. How do we do interdisciplinary work? How do we deal with the challenges of working with diverse populations? How do we give back and not sort of parachute in? We had a bunch of talks that were really, I think, fundamentally about challenges in measurement. How do we measure trust? What methods from other fields can we borrow? How do we measure insights, right? How do we measure things like communication and collaboration? We had a really nice talk on research transparency, I think, on data curation, which is a component of research transparency. How do we increase data sharing? How do we ensure repeatability of work? And then finally, Michael's very wonderful, there's Michael, provocation about how do we actually produce anything useful? So that being probably the most provocative thing, why don't we start at the bottom? Mariah's out there. Does anyone want to just start off the conversation on this topic of how do we or do we produce anything useful in visualization?
Oh, this one. Okay. Yeah. So I guess I was the last one to talk about this. So I'll open it up. Yeah. So practitioners work with people every day and impact millions of people. To repurpose a line that Daniel Fisher told me, if you want to have the most impact in visualization, you should work on the Excel product team and fix a bug, and you will make millions of people's lives better working with data every day. Whereas maybe two dozen people will read your paper. So, all right, that's a provocation. What are we doing?
I mean, so what I thought was really interesting about your talk, Michael, at the end is you were like, we could just do art exhibits, right? And my immediate response to that in my head was, you've got things like the Information is Beautiful Awards. We already have art exhibits. We could just like fold up Viz and just, all submit our work there. If practical impact is the thing that we care about, but I presume that's not what we want to do.
I'll have an opinion. So I've been having some really interesting and inspiring conversations as of late with people from humanities and from STS field. And one of the things that I've been hearing a lot of, or that my colleagues have been pitching at me is this idea of is Viz something that can help us humanize or add more context or kind of do the things to data that data is sort of meant to sort of not do. Okay, and so what I mean by that is there's been a lot of critique about data and big data. The whole point of it is to sort of strip away the messy details and be left with this sort of clean distilled thing. But especially, and as we've heard in some of our talks, when that data is around people are anything but clean and unmessy. And so I've been having colleagues who have been saying, well, what are ways that visualization can help us make things messy again and make things complex? And I love that idea. And it makes me think a lot of Georgia Lube, who gave a capstone here. Maybe it's dating myself. It was quite a few years ago at this point, but she had a lot of provocations around, the notion of soft data and how can we use visualization to soften data that otherwise looks hard and crisp. So it's something I've been grappling with a lot, and I don't exactly know what that means. But I'm sort of curious if other people have been thinking about this. It's kind of using visualization instead of making data, clean and crisp and efficient for people. How do we use it to trouble data and to make it messy again?
Hi, I'm Justin Rayner from Northeastern University. It was a really thought-provoking talk, and we've had a lot of discussions about kind of the same things. There was a paper by Parsons, I think, who talked about how practitioners actually don't use many data visualization processes at all, and when they're using data. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting takeaway from that paper. It was a survey of practitioners who use data. And then I've been working on a paper that's actually coming out in CGNA about interdisciplinary embracing disciplinary diversity and visualization. And I think one of the interesting things that we are trying to advocate in that is that Viz is inherently diverse, right? We touch nearly every field with data, but yet we're so closed off in the way that we produced visualizations in the first place, right? The idea of publishing papers and kind of the idea of paper types really kind of confines some of the design landscape. So I think that as a community, we need to kind of look beyond our horizons and really think about how we can accept approaches to visualization that are not necessarily from our own community.
And as a side note, please introduce yourself, because that helps, as you did, helps everyone get to know each other. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mariah. Çağatay Turkay, University of Warwick. A bit following on what you said, Mariah. think one area that I see an impact for visualization is also a bit in, and there was that discussion earlier on when we talked about trust, is maybe the role that visualization has in supporting critical thinking, with slow thinking and with data, not with experts, which the visualization community taught a lot about, but also in broader society, in working with communities, in sharing data or empowering communities to use their own data, empowering people to sort of reflect on their data. So there's a lot of real-world impact that visualization could engage with to make people to work with data and critically think with data. And another sort of point I was just noted down, and then this comment on it is quite interesting. There are lots of fields using visualization as a methodology, as a research methodology, using visualization as a tool, as part of a methodological inquiry. And I see that also another avenue that we don't engage a lot with. They use that in STS, in social science research. Visualizations are artifacts that people use to reason about data. So there are lots of different avenues that I think we can have impact.
Hi, Lonnie Besançon from Linköping University in Sweden. So thinking about the impact that we have, I think one thing that's been saying somehow provocatively recently is that maybe if we want to have an impact on how people use visualization, we should stop submitting to TVCG or Viz, because there's lots of things that we do in visualization that never take, even for other scientists, right, that they visualize data and present it in their papers. And there's like, I just found it now on my phone again. There was this paper, there was an editorial in PLOS Computational Biology, 10 Simple Rules for Better Figures, which I think is pretty much a good paper. They give some sensitive advice, but it's not written by anyone from the Viz community at all. I think 2 years ago, I saw a paper in Nature as well on how to present data in papers. That was kind of interesting, but ignoring probably everything that we do, which is also kind of interesting. And recently, an example I have of one of my papers, I looked at how to stop being binary when you analyze statistical data to avoid like this very harsh conclusions on your data. Most of the scientists actually work with this. There's lots of people working with this in all fields. They don't know about any of that. So I was somehow invited to present the results of these works because I'm connected to reproducibility journals and all of that. But without this, people wouldn't have known about this at all, although it applies directly to their work. So I wonder if there would not be value in actually trying sometimes to summarize the kind of work that we have and submit it to other venues where it could have impact beyond the simple, like, impacting and talking with the Viz community, because we don't necessarily need to know more about these kind of simple things sometimes, but other fields might need it.
Should I?
Yeah, please.
Hi, Narges Mahyar, University of Massachusetts Amherst. As someone who somehow migrated from building visualization for experts to do their visual analytics work better, to building visualization for the public and empowering them to have a voice in very complex civic decision-making, I feel like I'm making an impact that is important. However, I feel like there is a tension between how the incentives around academic and even visualization research has been built around novelty and other aspects rather than impact and applied work. So I feel like this brings a lot of tensions and rethinking about what are the incentives to think about, or do we need to think about like the impact of our work, or how do we need to think about like transferability as a measure of success in visualization or getting paper into our field. And the other thing that Michael alluded to was like working with people, working with community to see like how they're using visualization. But again, like building those visualization is not always something that is novel or interesting for the research community. So it's like thinking about all of these tensions and problems around these that are important.
I think we have online. Yeah. Oh, sorry. That's what I meant to say. We have an online question.
Oh, we do. Do we? Oh, Alper has his hand up. Cool.
Hey, Thanks. I'm gonna make
Go for
the
it.
YouTube stream, so I apologize that I start like 10 seconds later. I'm Alper Sarakai. I work on Microsoft's Power BI. I'm curious. I kind of want to go back to Mariah's point. I think it kind of started everything, but like kind of like softening the data, and I think that a lot more concentration on the individual differences slash like getting looped into the authoring and consumption kind of life cycle. Like, how is somebody like understanding this report that somebody's gotten, or like how does somebody that's making a bunch of visualizations for other people, how do they understand what's going on? And I think a lot of the research in this area can kind of feed back into like how people are using visualizations on the daily, which could have a pretty large impact.
Hey, okay. Hi, this is Petra Eisenberg from Inria. I must admit, I did miss the last session and I did miss Michael's talk. So one of the things but I did read his paper. So one of the things that I ask myself now is what definition of progress were you applying? And I guess I'm hearing this a little bit in lots of the comments here, in that progress needs to be large scale. It needs to be impacting millions of people or everybody in another domain or whatever. Is that really true? Like, and sure, I mean, there's many examples of impact from research that has had impact on the scale, but does it have to? It's a question for you. Do you want to give an answer?
So I grabbed a definition of progress for my talk, which was very just, you have more knowledge at the end than when you started, which is not necessarily that high of a bar, right? And I think, there's some scale in that it's a we, right? Like we have more knowledge as opposed to I, went off to the mountaintop and had a revelation about pie charts and then, didn't tell anybody. Which could happen. I think that would be pretty fun. But to me, there's some. To me, the most salient reason for like why am I here as opposed to fixing bugs in Excel is because I have intellectual curiosity around the problems in visualization, right? So that's a me problem. That is a very small scale curiosity that I can satisfy or not satisfy independently of the field. The field is just the people that keep me honest and tell me whether I've, make sure I'm on the right track and provide other things to think about. So you can think small scale and still make decisions about impact from your own personal lens of value and worth. And I do agree when you start thinking like in big utilitarian terms about the field as a whole, you sort of lose the forest for the trees there. But in terms of the actual, what progress means to you can be very idiosyncratic, but that doesn't mean necessarily that the ways that we measure progress are similarly idiosyncratic. Yeah, at a particular point in time. Yeah, it's a temporal field. Like I imagine a thought exercise that I think I mentioned on Slack, right, is when Viz was still a SIGGRAPH workshop, what kind of reviews do you think your papers would get this year? And vice versa, right? If a bunch of graphical perception folks were reviewing the SIGGRAPH papers back in the 90s. Right? For instance, like the tree map paper doesn't have a user study. What do we think about the tree map paper? I think Ben would say it's still a good paper. And it exists in a particular time frame.
So just picking up on that theme, by the way, Kyle Hall, TD Bank. One of the things that I've been musing about is, just comparing my own research journey as a visualization researcher to a family member who actually was involved in developing the polio vaccine. And when it comes to this notion of progress, I think one of the things that maybe we don't talk about is the personal risk involved in making the big advances. So in her case, she actually live mouth pipetted live virus, right, and actually put herself at risk. And I'm not suggesting anyone here should put themselves at physical risk, but the concept of what risk are we willing to expose ourselves to realize those massive feats of progress that actually really move the needle. And do we sometimes, for our own personal reasons and our own decisions around risk mitigation, actually maybe curtail the types of things we would aim for and strive for? That's more a question. I don't have an answer, but just a thought.
So hi, this is Petra again. So the session I was at while I wasn't here was the Viz Guide session, where I was watching Sheila's keynote, where I actually asked a very similar question about applying guidelines and how it requires confidence in yourself to go against the guidelines. And Sheila's response was really interesting because she talked about it being a risk, right? It's a risk. And I think the two topics are related because you have to feel confident to accept risk or to go against risk. So I think in that sense, yes, progress sometimes may require going against guidelines and accepting risks and being confident about yourself. But I see Sheila's here to share that. Maybe, yeah. Do they hear us? Do the people hear us on Zoom? They should, right?
Sorry?
The people on Zoom, they should hear us, do they?
Yeah, so I think if you're on Zoom, you should open up the live stream in the background so that you can also hear what's happening here. Thanks.
6 more to go.
Hi, Bernice Rogowitz, Visual Perspectives. So I think that the progress for visualization is measured in terms of the understanding of complex systems or data that it provides. So visualization by its nature is taking the data and creating visual representations that are somehow matched to human perception and cognition and help us make better, understand things better. So I think about, like, Mike Bostock has a paper called Visualizing Algorithms. And, it has these little animations, and you really understand sorting, or you really understand that a maze really is a tree because he shows it to you. And you don't have to understand the mathematics, you don't have to understand the deep foundations, but you see right away what these relationships are. So to me, this is an extraordinarily powerful set of tools we have. And I think that measuring progress is, we should be thinking about, to what extent are the inventions that we have really helping people understand the ever-growing complexities of our data, our algorithms, and processes.
So picking up on that so that we don't spend our entire time on this question, because we have talked about it for quite a while, perhaps that's a good time to talk about challenges in measurement, because the roots of BELIV are in getting beyond just talking about time and errors. What are the other ways that we can measure the effectiveness of a visualization? We talked today about borrowing techniques from behavioral economics and psychology to measure things like trust, or this perpetually squishy and annoying question of what are insights and how do we measure them? Any thoughts about these topics?
Hey, Jean-Daniel Fekete from INRIA in Paris-Saclay. So, yeah, excellent question. I guess we need to maybe come back to the initial question that we say that visualization helps understanding data. So I guess what we want to know is how do you measure how well people understand data? So all of these insights are kind of proxies or approximation for that. I guess we have never found out methods for checking how you could say, now I understand the data. So going in that direction, what is understanding would be would be great, especially when people are talking about explainable AI. At some point, means that somebody understands what's there, and there is still no definition of what understanding means. So it would be great to think more about the deep question of how do you measure understanding? That would be one interesting, deep question.
I think Nargis has a hand up. Behind you.
Thanks so much. Hey, Nargis again. Thank you for asking that question, Jean-Daniel. It has been on our mind for so long. How do we measure how people are engaged with our visualization? We decided that interacting with a link or clicking on the interactive visualization is not a measure of how people are engaged, or how maybe they are just stuck, maybe they are frustrated, maybe they can't get the information they want. So the paper that my student is presenting on Wednesday, Design with Pictograph, is all about thinking about how we can borrow measures from other disciplines like education about how can we structurally and systematically measure understanding of people of visualization. So you might be interested in that.
Should also point out Jason's excellent point here on the screen that maybe the word measure is probably imposing some epistemology on the discussion. Something else I would sort of provoke people to whenever we start talking about understanding, I always start thinking about decision making. I think often in visualization, we're using visualizations to make some kind of decision, and that might be something that we can measure decision quality as perhaps a better proxy to understanding than, reporting the ratio of the size of 2 bars or something like that, right?
I'll jump in on that. So we had interesting discussions this summer at a dog stool around decision making and, in this case, uncertainty and stuff. And I think one of the things that always seems so difficult about decision making is we're rarely interested in things where there's a right and wrong answer. So even this idea of what does it mean for us to sort of study or try to reflect on the role of a visualization in decision making? For me, the idea of taking it to a measurement is just the things that we can actually say with any certainty, oh, that was a good decision. These are usually tasks that you don't even really need a visualization for. And so I've been, one of the things I find challenging, but also really intriguing is trying to sort of step back and even question more fundamentally, what's the role of visualization, not as something to measure, but as something more to understand. And this, of course, alludes to Jason's point too, which is there's other ways for us to come to know about how visualizations work in the world that don't necessarily involve measurements and metrics. And I know we and several others, including Michael was there too, had a lot of interesting conversations around what those shifts in perspectives might lead to.
So this is Petra again. So this is not a direct answer to that point, but one of the things I recently became really clear to me is that what we're really missing is some more talk about language that we use when we either want to capture something, or I'm thinking of capturing something more in the sense of, let's say, a qualitative study when you want to talk to people and you ask them how they experience their data or their visualization, or if you want to measure in a scale, right? If you have a Likert scale with a whole bunch of items, what should be the words in those items? And for many types of things that we want to measure, people just invent the terms. Or they use some that seem intuitively right, but there's not enough research about how we use language there. And the same in qualitative studies. I think people people ask questions using the language that they think is right for the moment, but maybe there's something to be said about how we should be asking some sort of questions about similar themes that we might be interested in studying. So there's lots to be done there, I think.
Yeah, I think about like certain fields where they wouldn't even put something in a survey if it hasn't been, thoroughly validated and has several studies demonstrating its reliability, right? I want to pause for a second because there's been like 5 people talking for the past little bit. I wonder if, I don't want to point anyone out, but there are a bunch of other folks out here. Does anyone have any thoughts who hasn't expressed an opinion yet? Yeah.
I guess on the
Can
top,
you say your name and affiliation? And all that?
Charles from Northwestern. On the topic of understanding visualization, I think that's a really tricky task because some people, I believe there is a finite amount of information to be derived from any given data visualization, and perhaps one could measure a person's understanding by investigating what percentage of that finite set of information one could acquire. But also people design and visualize things often with a purpose. So maybe finding an answer to the questions they had a priori is perfect understanding in that context. I'm not sure which is the right definition of understanding.
Hi, Georgia from UCL. I just want to come back here to a little bit what's been said here. Like, I have the feeling that visualization is not necessarily a thing always. So it could be also the process of visualizing that gives that understanding. I don't know if anybody else has had this experience, but working with experts, it wasn't actually the visualization that suddenly made them magically realize the insights, but it was the process of trying to get there that brought the insight. So then is the final visualization useless? Or was the process the whole point of the whole, project in the first place, right? I don't know.
There was lots of nodding. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, Michael Carell, Tableau. I wonder if you view the lens of visualization as just one other type of communication, along with speech and writing, I guess some of these questions about measurement just are sort of at the wrong level of description, right? Like you don't talk about, you can sometimes say, you should use the word use rather than utilize, right? And that makes a particular judgment. Is that the same thing we're meaning when we say you should use a pie chart or not use a pie chart and instead use a stacked bar chart or things like that? So I kind of wonder if communication is inherently situated and purposeful, and we're attempting to produce measurements that are not situated and are not purposeful. And if so, that is a doomed enterprise. And so the measurements are in service of something. We are not in service of the measurements.
I like the visualization as writing perspective. I often kind of think the easiest way to make a good visualization is to hire a visualization designer with 5 to 10 years of experience making good visualizations, right? Do we produce knowledge of how to make visualizations, or do we just produce people who can make good visualizations? This kind of the provocation that you had at the end of your talk, Michael, about, is the apprenticeship model the model? In which case, I doubt people spend a bunch of time measuring the effectiveness of different techniques for writing prose in novels, right? Like, or if they do, is that useful? I don't know.
So just kind of following up on this conversation. So one thing that came to my mind from the discussion on visualization guidelines, and sorry, I'm Hannah from UMD. And even with this discussion, a lot of the times people aren't just creating visualizations for insight, right? They probably have an insight that they are trying to communicate to an audience. And one thing that in my paper that I'll be presenting on Thursday, shameless plug, talked to a bunch of data analysts to understand how they design visualizations. And a lot of them are creating these visualizations for other people. And one of the constraints that kept on coming up was how much influence the audience they're creating these visualizations for play into whatever choices they make, whether it's design because you're trying to tell them a specific thing, you're trying to tell them, you're trying to motivate them to make certain business decisions. And so kind of like, I don't think we really look, or this is my very naive understanding, opinion rather, I don't think we really explore that process of coming up with, designs for people and communicating visualizations to people, to other people who may not necessarily be as tech savvy, and how exactly can we both design effective and visualizations that are both effective and also really do hit the point in persuading people to make decisions.
Hey, Nargis Mahir again, UMass Amherst. So Michael's point somehow reminded me of this classic book, Reflective Practitioner, which talks about how architects and practitioners are not only using their artifact, but it's also reflecting and pointing and a lot of gesture and interaction with the artifact. So talking about measures of visualization is just beyond how people are working or creating or looking at visualization, but how they're talking about visualization, how they're communicating with each other as they're working with visualization. So I remember when we wanted to, this is 2014 paper, we wanted to measure awareness between a team. We decided that measuring awareness is almost an impossible task. We decided it's best to measure lack of awareness by analyzing all of the conversation between team members and seeing like where they don't have an awareness of what's going on with another person's work. So it all becomes with thinking outside the box and thinking about creative ways of measuring things that are really hard to measure. Like I had this conversation with Jeremy Boy at some point about measuring engagement, and he was like, maybe we should measure lack of engagement by understanding why people are disengaged. So just some ideas.
We have a comment on Zoom. Hello?
Yes. Net. I was just wondering, so maybe from a technology and if you say, okay, psychology perspective, now there are these more and more EEG and other types of sensors that are being integrated into going back again to HMDs, so head-mounted displays, that can provide a cost-effective way of measuring the at least in the immediate response or perception. I'm not sure of the participants what a given visualization. And yeah, I'm wondering if that would be a significant next step.
Çağatay Türkay, University of Warwick. I mean, it feels like we often want to understand much more complex things about how visualization work out there and in the world, and how it's having an impact on the different questions. I mean, we have seen papers about how visualizations could persuade people about like COVID vaccinations, and we have talked about trust issues. But of course, these are processes that take a very long time to develop. Maybe you look at visualizations for a year or sort of certain data or a year, you talk to others. But of course, these are sort of contextual processes that are very hard to observe. Maybe a few things that Nargis mentioned just now is like talking to people, how these processes work. That's the way to go. But of course, we have to be practical, and then we just run online studies, experiments, where we just put 2 visualizations in front of people. Okay, what do you think? Are you persuaded now? We are bound by those methods in a way that are available to us. That's a big issue. And maybe that's also where we can find our niche in a way that maybe we are also different than cognitive psychology in a way, or at least we can approach this differently than the common scientific practices by looking at the context, by looking at visualizations more in the wild and how they exist out there.
Hi, Jean-Daniel Fequet from INRIA in Paris-Saclay again. So yeah, maybe I'm saying things that are obvious to everyone, but I think we already started to discuss about this similarity between language, written language, and visualization and perception. I think that's a very good way. My feeling is a very good way of thinking about visualization. The communication channel is not the same, the artifacts are not the same, the training is not the same, but still, to me, it's very similar. And so I think what we have been talking about recently, like in the different things, that are the several levels of the language. So of course, at the beginning, people have to learn how to read the characters, and that's the beginning of reading some visual representation and the meaningful part of the visual representation. Then you read things like words, which are more like if you have a visualization, what this pattern means or what that pattern means. And so that's the next level. But then, of course, you get higher and higher in sophistication and higher in trying to understand things. So maybe there is also this issue with BELIV to try to sort out what are the different levels of understanding of a visualization, and to when we measure something, to be clear about whether it's at the learning level that you want to recognize a particular pattern and you were not trained for that, so you don't recognize it, so you don't see what is the phenomenon that you're looking at, to the higher level where you see that there is a phenomenon like a global warming, but you refuse to admit it, so then you have something in between, and that's very similar to language, where you see an argument, but you disagree with the argument. Also, you understand it, but you disagree, so you block it somehow. So maybe having also a way to specify those multiple levels. So coming back with this idea of tests that are done for kids, for reading tests, there are at least 9 levels of reading tests for kids, from the role, being able to read characters, to understanding a complex document with subtle language variation. So maybe going in that direction to try to find out several levels of understanding of visualization might be an interesting way of going through what is understanding and at what level we're talking about. Just a thought.
I think Michael had a hand down here, unless that was a phantom. No?
Okay, so to push on Jean-Daniel's metaphor a little bit, right? We have those reading levels. Oh, I'm Michael Krell, tableau again, right? But I feel like a lot of pedagogy is more like sort of the French style dictées, right? Like you will spell this exactly correctly and put the accents in the exact right place. So I feel like we're often, especially within computer science, not well positioned to build these kind of nuanced understanding comprehension questions. And instead, there's a lot of emphasis on sort of procedural laws and measurements around, like, if your data is like this, you must do this. So I wonder if that suggests difference not just in measurement, but also in pedagogy and levels beyond it. Or, you know, or even sort of in art school, right? Like, and you must know the rules in order to break them, but you will eventually break them.
Bernice?
Yeah, I'd like to share an example of a sort of a teaching tool that I used. I was teaching a master's level course in visualization for people who are doing visual data analytics, data science people. And we all had the same data set. Everybody had to create visualizations based on these data. And what I did is I had for every person everyone created a visualization, and they had to write down what they felt they were sharing. What were they communicating in their visualization? And then we switched papers, and people had to write, oh, here's this visualization. What did I extract? What did I think the meaning was in this visualization? And then we got together in pairs, and it was absolutely astounding because people thought that they were making a certain point, or they were emphasizing something, or showing a pattern or a correlation. And it was, in many cases, it was just largely missed by the person who was receiving it. And that dialogue ended up being very rich because sometimes it was an error on the part of not an error, but the person creating the visualization could have made other choices that would have been more clear, so the process or the phenomenon would be more understandable. And sometimes it was the point of view of the person who was reading it, who didn't have, as much literacy to really be able to understand. So I did that because I wanted to focus not so much on, do we know, 18 different ways of representing the data, but which ways of representing are really going to help communicate the meaning to another human.
So I think I want to steer us back to one more topic before we conclude, which is ethics, because we had, I think, a really amazing talk from Casey at the beginning of the day for folks who were able to see that. If you weren't, I encourage you, when it is eventually posted on the internet, which I believe it will be, to watch that. And, I think one of the things that kind of resonated with me when we were just talking, like, I can't remember, maybe Jean Daniel or someone was making a point about, like, these online studies, like, are we wasting participants' time, basically? And is it ethical for us to be running these studies at all if we don't feel that we're learning that much from them?
Wow.
So that's a very interesting question. Oh, I'll stand over here. I guess one thing, just to kind of, pick up Kyle Hall, by the way, TD. One way to tackle this question would be to say that if you were transparent with the participants and they are receiving some sort of monetary, compensation, then it's essentially, so long as you've been transparent, there's been a fair exchange of goods. So I don't know, maybe that I'm being a bit simplistic there,
fair
but
point.
there is one way to take that. But I think what you might be getting at is sort of the higher level ethical question, not with the individual participants, but maybe when it comes to the utilization of grant money and the grander piece around how we fit into a society as a whole, and whether even if the individual participant research relationship is ethical, we haven't actually been ethical to a higher calling, if you will.
I sorry, cannot refrain, Jean Daniel Fekete again. So my feeling about ethics, what I like to do when thinking about ethics is this sentence: make no harm. So that's how I see ethics. So you have to think about, am I harming someone? Am I harming the earth or something? So if you pay too many people for an online thing, who are you harming anyway? So maybe you're using too much resources on the system, but it seems very small. It depends on the thing. Of course, if you're using supercomputers to compute something completely silly, then you're using that resources and it generates a lot of CO2, and that's bad. So you are harming the Earth and us. But for online study that are useless, you're basically wasting your money, but I don't see the harm. So I think that's the translation that I always doing when people are talking about ethics. Who is harmed and how? And I don't see any harm in doing useless experiments, except maybe wasting your money, but that's not harming anyone else than yourself. So I guess that's the way I judge everything. And then, of course, sometimes it's very hard to know or to realize that you're harming somebody or something because you haven't thought of that. But that's another story. Just to try to make it clear, transforming the question about ethics, which is a great big word, into no harm.
Perhaps we're wasting a bunch of reviewers' time. I'm just spitballing, right? Like reputation of the community, yeah.
Just building on that, then I think one thing that's been really interesting that I've heard in the more industrial context would be the discussion of Friedman and Freeman. So for those of you who don't know, there's essentially, in capitalistic terms, there are kind of two schools of thought when it comes to markets, and one would be stakeholder theory, emphasizing that the company is responsible to all of the stakeholders and that that's the driving principle. And the other is shareholder, and basically, the company is responsible to the people whom it actually is owned by, and that's the bottom line. But the key to both, and I think this then builds off the notion, well, it's distinct from the notion of harm, is to whom are we accountable, right? Are we accountable to a particular organization? Are we accountable to a society? Are we accountable to the funding agency that gave us money to do the work we're doing?
Hey there, Connor Scully Allison, University of Utah. I just want to respond to the idea of do no harm as being a good foundational, criteria for ethics, insofar as I don't think that will always work. A counterexample I want to raise is this idea that it's something that's happening very frequently in research too, especially with online research, is this idea of underpaying participants. I don't think it's necessarily harmful to give people $12 for 30 minutes of work. Like there you go, or for an hour of work, right? $12 for an hour of work. But I also don't think it's necessarily ethical. I think the ethical thing is to maximize the good and make sure that people are paid fairly for their time. Is harmful to you? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair assessment of harm, but I don't think that's maybe a universal definition of harm. I don't like it. I'm not advocating for underpaying people. I'm just saying, a lot of people would say harm is like, what they're worth, yeah. I mean, fair enough.
Is that harmful, or is that just kind of unfair?
Well, that's my argument, is that I think the argument can be made that it's perceived as unfair and not necessarily harmful, but that depends upon what your definition of harm is.
Do you want to respond? You don't have to.
I mean, I expect we won't resolve that.
He's passing. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. Justin Rayner from Northeastern. I think one of the things that struck me in that ethics talk this morning was just the idea that because data is available doesn't mean it's right to use. Even if there's an IRB or something that says that this isn't a human research study, or you don't need permission in order to use it. But I think that really is an interesting question of putting the onus on visualization researchers to really qualify if the data is right to use. What's the intent of using the data? Not always to be, I want to create something better or faster or whatever, but that there should be some kind of moral intent to how you're using the data. And then another point that I really liked was the idea that visualization researchers are not always coupled with the data producers, and that there might be an opportunity for visualization researchers to work much more closely with data producers to making sure that the data that they are producing is ethically sound. So I thought that that was kind of an interesting question of putting the onus on visualization researchers to make sure that we're doing right.
Yeah, Lonnie was also from Linköping University, Sweden. Talking about accountability a little bit earlier brought me to some points that I think are worth mentioning, because you just mentioned that, right? I think there's not enough discussion on what it means to be a scientist these days in terms of what is our job there. Like, I mean, there's discussions about, if we think about how we give back to participants of studies, for instance, like bringing back the knowledge to them at the end, not just in the form of a paper that's behind a paywall, but also explaining to them what actually has happened, and all of that doesn't happen often enough. And if we think about it, who is paying our research very often? It's taxpayers, right? So even beyond participants, I think we should actually just make the effort to communicate about what we found. But then again, it's also very difficult because this is not part of the whole research assessment. And so this time that you spend explaining your research results is never valued. But I think there's also questions about, like, beyond the research that we do, like the research that we can read and react to when it can be harmful. What is our responsibility there? Like, should we act on it? Because we're not paid for that, right? Like, but what should we do in this case? Like, who is accountable for, like, as a scientist, reading something that's inherently badly done, might impact people's lives, and not reacting to this? Like, how do we tackle this? I think this is an important issue as well. The whole correction of scientific literature is never a topic, actually, but there's a lot to be done there, and we don't talk about this enough, I suppose.
Yuriya from UCL again. What I really like I'm gonna go somewhere different with this, sorry. What I really like from the talk this morning, and what I kept, and it also relates to the discussions we had in the Viz for Good little group, was that you could, like in CHI, they have this ethics review committee that actually also educates slowly the reviewers and even the authors of how to document their studies and how to be more ethical also in how they make their studies. So I think that's something that we could really benefit from. Not so much to act as gatekeepers, like, and reject papers outright, but to use it as an education mechanism to slowly kind of insert this kind of way of thinking into our papers, let's say, slowly.
I think Jason made a related point up there about actually getting things into papers. Yeah. I thought I saw a hand, but maybe it's gone.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
So I'm going to change the direction again, but I wanted to go back to the statement, what you were bringing up. This idea that we as Viz people have an opportunity to sort of challenge the producers of the data and things like that. And on one hand, yes, I completely agree. On another hand, at least in my own experience, a lot of the people, in a lot of the projects I do where we are working with others and designing visualizations with and for others, it's often the grad students that are the ones that are doing the collaboration and that are the ones that are interacting with the domain experts. And often those domain experts are PIs or senior people. And I think there's also considerations of sort of the power in that situation too. I sort of imagine myself if I were like a sort of junior grad student, and here I am working with some like kind of like big deal scientists, and they're using data that I'm not sure is ethical. And oh, by the way, we had a project where this was very much the case. How is someone in that situation supposed to challenge? And maybe the answer is we need to learn how to have the confidence and the skills to do that. But I also think that there's interesting questions around who should challenge and how do we do that? How do we have those systems in place for it too? I think it's complicated.
This is from Sheila.
Yeah, Mariah's point reminds me that, as visualization designers, I've tried this metaphor a few times, but we're the first and sometimes only contact that people have with the data. right? Like, especially for mass audiences. There was a thing about how no one clicks on New York Times interactives, they just look at the picture, right? Certainly of those people, very few of them are looking at the underlying data table and confirming it, or talking to the people who collected the data and reading their methods section. So we have both power in that we have a lot of control over the message that gets produced with data, but also additional responsibilities beyond, like, we're not a transparent lens from the data set to someone's like visual cortex. Like we get to make some of these methodological decisions either implicitly or otherwise because no one else is.
I just wanted to respond to Mariah's comment. I definitely agree that there's absolute challenges with respect to that, but I think that I'd like to approach it more as like an opportunity to incorporate data collection within our visualization methodologies. That it shouldn't always be a divorced relationship between the producers and the designers. That like, hey, here's a data set, data visualization researcher, go do something with it, produce something back for us. I think that like you can almost embed visualization researchers in that data collection process to begin with. That might be an opportunity.
Yeah, Jean-Daniel Fequiet again, INRIA again, Paris-Saclay still. So yeah, I like this idea of responsibility, and I'm super sensitive about it because I'm working a lot on multidimensional projection, and I think for text, for documents, and I always feel uneasy about that because I'm giving that to users out there. And there is kind of a statement that if I'm giving that to users out there, it should be good enough for them to find things and not make too many mistakes. So I have the obligation to check that what they receive is okay. But when I read about the research on multidimensional projection, it's about going faster, using better algorithms, and hardly ever about checking that what is pushed away is okay at some level of okay. And so is that ethical question to say you can play with the data as long as you don't show it to real users, but if you show it to real users, there is an obligation that you have to try hard to make sure that you're not pushing garbage to the users. And maybe that's an ethical question. If people say, I've been creating a new algorithm and I look at the numbers for the performance, maybe okay, but if I give it to real users, then check something else, like whether it's good.
So I think maybe the responsibility to try hard to not push garbage to users is a good place to end. As we're running up on time and my battery is about to die. So Michael is going to come up and give a closing, and then that will be it. Thank you all for participating in this discussion. Also the folks online for also participating. Thank you so much.
Right. So we have 2 minutes left, which is great because I only have 3 slides, so that's about my speed. So first off, I just want to thank everyone for attending what I think was a full day of really interesting talks that spanned a lot of fields that still all felt core to the BELIV mission. I want to particularly thank the other members of the organizing committee as well as our program committee, which again, too many to fit on one slide. Highly recommend that you put that off and read it online. But then I want to give everyone here some homework. So the homework I want to give them, right, is that this is a biennial workshop. So this was BELIV 2022. Next one is not for another 2 years. And so we have a lot of lead time to think about what BELIV is and what it should be. So in particular, right, like We had a theme this year around sort of ethical and inclusive and accessible visualization. What's going to be on the tip of our tongues in 2 years' time? We are mere mortals organizing this conference. There are other mere mortals we would like to help organize as well. So what should the makeup of BELIV look like? And then lastly, as hopefully this session was evidence of, we have freedom about format, right? It's about what we think of as a community. We're sort of allowed to be a little bit more navel-gazy perhaps than other venues. And so what that gives us is an opportunity to think about how things should be formatted. Who are we talking to? How are we talking to them? It doesn't have to be a conference paper. It doesn't have to be a presentation. It doesn't have to be a debate. What are the other methods that we have of communicating? Who's going to write the first BELIV zine, for instance? Yeah. That was a fist pump from Andrew, so I believe that's legally binding. Right, so those are the questions that I want on people's minds, and thinking about maybe even after these specific conversations of the day fade, is what should BELIV look like, not next year, but 2 years from now. And so with that, those are the end of my 3 slides, and I will end once again with thank you, and I hope to see you all again in 2024.